Corinthians 6:18, Job 31:1, and Matthew 5:28. Three very famous verses from the Bible dealing with the topic of lust. And in this video, we're going to look at them in the light of the Vedic literatures or the philosophy found in the ancient scriptures of India. In particular, the Song of God, or also known as the Bhagavad Gita. Welcome to American Krishna. If you're here for the first time, I make videos based on the ancient wisdom of India as an introduction to what's called Krishna consciousness. I've been basically celibate for the last 30 years, and one of my greatest struggles by far for the last 3 decades has been sexual purity. And I say having because I believe, and if you also believe, then this video is specifically for you, that sexual purity, in other words, not having sex outside of marriage, is ultimately the best thing one can do for oneself and for society at large. However, it's not that easy. On the contrary, it's quite hard. And so that's why I say it's been the hardest thing for me to do practically for the last 30 years. So let's look at these verses and then we'll talk about them in the light of what's called Krishna consciousness, right? So here's 5:28, Matthew. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So this makes you think of this idea of there's, thinking, willing, and acting, right? And if you saw one of those Star Wars movies, the one that came out approximately in 2001, there's a scene when Yoda is speaking to Luke Skywalker, and he's basically telling him verbatim one of the most important instructions that Krishna tells Arjuna in the Song of the Lord, or the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna tells Arjuna, Dhyayato Vishayan Pumsan Sanghats Teshu Pajayate Sangat Sanjayate Kama Kama Krodha Bhajayate Krodhat Bhavati I forgot the rest. But basically, here's the translation. While contemplating on the objects of the senses, one develops attachment from them. And from such attachment, lust develops. From lust, anger arises. And from anger, bewilderment of memory. When memory is bewildered, intelligence is lost. And when intelligence is lost, one falls down again into the material pool.
Fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering.
So unpacking these very important verses, the idea is that when you contemplate on the object of, if you objectify the other sex, the other person, let's say you're heterosexual and say you're a man, when you objectify a woman, instead of seeing her as a soul who happens to be inside a female human body, but you actually just see her as a body and you objectify that body, and then you just want to put your greasy hands on them, as one of my main spiritual teachers, Dr. Resnick, or Hridayananda Goswami, he uses that analogy, putting your oily fingers on the objects that you covet, then, well, that's basically that verse from Matthew, right? Even though you may not have had sex with her, you're already committing adultery in your mind. So the best thing is to not, to be careful where you put your eyes and what you think of, because from thinking, willing, and then acting, so it all starts on the subtle level. And so that's why, for example, if you watch pornography, there's very good chances that you'll end up masturbating, right? Because you watch, you're contemplating, and then you get to the act part of it. So the question of being very intelligent, and always, and I'm preaching to myself here, always taking shelter of God when the beginning stages of contemplating start. Now, verse 2 that we were talking about, Corinthians 6:18. Flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. So here I would say, well, you don't really sin against your own body because you're not really your body. It's just like you can't really sin against your own car, right? And that's one of the main problems I find in Christianity, with all due respect, is a sort of a unclear ontology. What I mean by that is an unclear definition of who the real person is, right? I mean, even Plato talks about the soul as being the real person and being freed from the prison of the body. So that type of idea where, and you certainly find that in the Vedic literatures, where the soul is really who we really are. We are spiritual beings. We just happen to be inside physical bodies, right? And so when you're, committing adultery, when you're sinning, when you're, in the language of Krishna consciousness, breaking the regulative principles, you're not sinning against the vehicle that you happen to be in. Again, you can't really, imagine if you were driving this car, you can't sin against a machine. A machine is inert. A machine has no consciousness, right? So this body without the soul inside is just a car. As a matter of fact, in the Bhagavad Gita, that same famous text I quote, hey doggy, Krishna says that the body is just like a car, like a vehicle. The technical term is yantra. So this is where we would differ from this verse from the Bible, where when you commit what's called illicit sex, you're sinning against your own self as a soul, not against your body. You're using your body to degrade your consciousness, and in that sense you're doing harm to yourself spiritually. And you are sort of displeasing God, not in a sort of a jealous, angry God way, but in a way that God will, come to the conclusion, as he warns in the Bhagavad Gita, that lust is, a gateway to hell. It's a source of suffering, especially, in the mode of passion. There I would recommend to go to chapter 14 and 17 of the Gita. In that sense, you're, displeasing him, because he's unhappy that you're going to be unhappy as a result, precisely, of sinning, right? So now let's look at verse number 3. The last one we had here is from Job 31:1. Well, just to finish on that last one, flee from sexual immorality. That's an important instruction. We should really take lust, and again, I'm preaching to myself, we should really take lust as something that's really not good for us. And therefore we should flee from it. We should be really try our very best to avoid falling prey to lust, right? And it all starts, like we saw at that very first, it all starts with contemplation and thinking and so on. So we should try to, nip it at the bud with whatever spiritual intelligence we may have, So now, finally, the last verse, 3:31, Job. I made a covenant with my eyes not to look lustfully at a young woman. Easier said than done, right? Easier said than done. I mean, the Vedic literatures, again, nothing against women here at all. Because remember, we're not even women or men. We're souls inside bodies. But the human form of a woman is mentioned in the Vedic literatures as, Maya. Maya, in other words, illusion or temptation. Again, if you're a woman, remember, you're not a woman. You're a soul inside a woman's body. So don't get offended here. And as a matter of fact, the third canto of another text called the Bhagavatam flips the same idea, that a form of a man is Maya or illusion for a soul in a woman's body. So it's the same dynamic going both ways. But it is undeniable that the form of a woman is especially melting to the butter. I mean, the analogy of butter and fire is literally there in the Vedic literatures, and it really is in terms of men, melting at the sight of a woman. So, therefore, this verse from Job, where you say, I have made a covenant not to look at a beautiful woman, easier said than done. Easier said than done, right? Because precisely, for someone who's not liberated from lust, the attraction, a form of a young beautiful woman is very, very difficult not to look at. So what's the solution here? Do we live a life where we're constantly hyper vigilant about not looking at any woman? You have to be careful in that sense. We spoke about the triggers and so on. we spoke about those triggers and so on. But the most important consideration is this idea of higher taste. I speak about this a lot in my videos. Higher taste. It's mentioned in the 2nd chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, where God himself says that it's impossible basically to resist temptations unless you're experiencing a higher taste. And what is this higher taste? According to the Vedic literatures, a higher taste is love that's coming from God himself. The reciprocation of God with a dependent, loving soul. You know, when we depend on Krishna or God. Shut up, ChatGPT. When we try our best to depend on God and to take shelter of God and to please God by our lifestyle, our activities, our prayers, our chanting, our reading of sacred scripture, our treating other souls respectfully and so on, then God, who is in our own heart, as he mentions in the Bhagavad Gita, reciprocates with us and gives us his love and reveals himself. And since he is the source of all happiness by definition, right? And the source of all happiness and love, if he reveals himself or shows himself inside our own heart just a little bit, then we become filled with that same love, with that same peace, with that same satisfaction, that same higher taste. And once you have that higher taste, you don't go for the lower taste. If I give you $100 and you have $10 and I say to you, listen, give me your $10 and keep $100, you'll be like, yeah, I'll make $90 profit. Here it is, right? But if I say, hey, just give me your $10, you're not going to give it because that's the only money you have, right? So if sex pleasure, for example, lust, right? Acting on lust, which certainly does give temporary but real pleasure. I mean, not real in the ultimate sense, because everything's temporary here, but you know what I mean. If that's all you have, you're not going to let it go, because we all want to be happy, and if that's the only happiness we get, then we cling to that $10. But theoretically, and I speak a little bit from experience, if you are getting way more happiness from another source, which in this case is, as I described, God's reciprocation with us, then it's like, who cares about those $10? Like, I'm getting something much higher, much better, the higher taste. So while yes, we should be careful, as we described in this video, the most important thing is to try to connect with God in such a way that we feel God's love, God's reciprocation, and then having obtained that, having experienced that, we just have a lot easier time in not giving in to lust, because our heart, our mind is absorbed in thoughts of that all beautiful God. So those are a few words on the Bible, those 3 verses on lust in the light of Krishna consciousness. Let me know your thoughts in the comments and descriptions, and thanks again for watching.
Nobody greater. Nobody greater. Couldn't find nobody. Nobody greater. Nobody greater than you. Nobody greater than you. I dare you lift your hands and say that with us tonight.